and this will be available on our YouTube channel. In Participedia, students really find these type of videos and resources valuable in courses. So we urge some engagement with this after the fact. But that being said, I would just like to formally welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for another iteration of the Participedia Participatory Governance Cluster Seminar Series in what will surely be a stimulating and I hope at times provocative conversation. My name is Paul Miljanovich. I'm the Managing Director of Participedia. Participedia, as many of you know, is the world's largest database documenting and researching democratic innovations around the world. I will admit that although I have not read Hans's book, this will now be my third attended panel on the topic, the second one that we, Participedia, have hosted. I also now have had students in my classes actively cite the material, and I also see firsthand how the book in the Participedia community is serving really as an important resource that is bringing together different people's perspectives and fields in what I think will lead to really impactful and collaborative outcomes. And so in that sense, it's really a privilege for Participedia to host today's conversation. Before I formally pass it off to Friedel Marquardt to facilitate this session, I would like to offer a moment of grounding in the form of what we at Participedia call our community land acknowledgement. I'll now share my screen. Although a digital database and global community, Participedia is grounded at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, what is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga nations. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, visible on your right. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement describes the dish to represent the territory and one spoon to symbolize the peoples living on and sharing the resources of the land, only taking what we need and keeping, importantly, the dish clean. We recognize the ongoing effects of colonial erasure, marginalization, and extraction, of which we are all intimately a part of. And we encourage all Participedia members and those joining us today to reflect solidaristically on the Indigenous sovereignties, colonial legacies, and life relations on the land in which you are residing or find yourself on in this moment, and to find ways to actively support those Indigenous communities. Welcome once again. Thank you for joining. Friedel, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Paul. I will just play around with the screen a little bit so that I can bring my notes up as well. Excellent. Is everybody able to hear me clearly? Great, excellent. So, welcome to today's Participedia Participatory Governance Occasional Seminar Series. Bit of a tongue twister there. But this is a series where we showcase some of the work the Participatory Governance Cluster has been doing, and today is the fourth seminar in this series. So, as mentioned before, my name is Friedel Marquardt, and I am a research assistant here at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, and in Participedia's Participatory Governance Cluster, and I am the facilitator today. But before I continue, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which the Centre and the University of Canberra is situated, and pay my respects to their culture and contribution to the life of Canberra and the region. I also acknowledge all other First Nations peoples on whose land we are gathering today. We are presenting across multiple time zones today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us both online and in the room. And I also want to give a big thank you to Paul Miljanovich and Jesse Carson from Participedia for all the coordination and hosting the seminars over this year, and to Julian Friedel from Demo Labs at the University of Stuttgart for facilitating all the other occasional seminars in this series. But today we are very excited to hear from Hans Asenbaum about his latest open access book, The Politics of Becoming, Anonymity and Democracy in the Digital Age, which explores the affordances of the digital age for expressing ourselves differently and what that means for democratic engagement. Hans is a senior research fellow here at the Centre, and his research interests include radical democracy, queer and gender studies, digital politics, and participatory research methods. His work has been published in the American Political Science Review, New Media and Society, Politics and Gender, and the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. And so the structure for today is that Hans will present for about half an hour, and then we will go into Q&A for about the same amount of time. And yeah, I'm looking forward to a very engaging discussion. So I'll bring the slides up and then over to you, Hans. Sorry, everyone, just give me a moment. I'll bring these up.
Right.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, thank you so much, Friedel, for organizing, for hosting the seminar, and thank you, Participedia, for making this talk possible, for all the organizational work, and for the opportunity to talk a little bit about this book that's now finally out. The last time I talked about it with Participedia, it was still not out, so it's finally now available, and I'm very happy about that. So the book talks about identities, explores identities and their role in political participation, and asks which kind of agency, which kind of freedom we as democratic subjects have to self-create our identities, to change and alter our identities, and to explore our multiple selves. So okay, so the book is open access thanks to Participedia, among a couple of other groups that contributed to covering the open access fee, for which I'm obviously very grateful. I think it's very much in the spirit of Participedia to share knowledge, and so I'm grateful for the support and being part of the Participedia project as well. It's okay, it's changing. Yeah, sorry, I'm just learning the slides, how to change the slides. So the book talks about or starts from the democratic spaces, and I think that's very much in the spirit of Participedia as well. So the different spaces, like the closed spaces of parliaments, the invited spaces, such as participatory budgets, citizens' assemblies, and the claimed spaces that social movements create themselves. So a very broad understanding of democracy, broad understanding of democracy as where people actually come together to do democracy in a very embodied way. So, of course, when we assemble on these kind of spaces or create these kind of spaces together, our identities matter, right? So the identities that we display are with our bodies, through our bodies, the identities that have been socially created matter, and the power hierarchies that exist around these democratic spaces in a way bleed into these democratic spaces, while the spaces themselves try to create an equal setting for democratic participation. Our identities matter here. And okay, and so in the 1990s, a discourse around the politics of becoming emerged, claiming that these power hierarchies within these spaces could best be contested by actively performing marginalization. So by drawing attention to the marginalized identities in society, so very concretely through social movements, identity politics, through quotas in parliaments, through affirmative action, active policies that actually draw attention to these kinds of physical marginalization. And we have seen in the past that these identity politics also work, right? So if we look at the suffragette movement as an example, or more recently, the slut walks, or also recently the Black Lives Matter movement, we can see that these movements are highly impactful, and they actually have an impact on society in bringing about this kind of social change, very much in the intentions, following the intentions of the politics of presence. However, the feminist democratic theorists themselves, talking in the 1990s about the politics of presence, have also pointed out that there is an inherent dilemma with the idea of the politics of presence, which they call the dilemma of which they call the can I change that? Yeah, cool, that's great. Which they call the dilemma of difference, right? So there is an inherent problem, which is that if we perform marginalization and draw attention to marginalization by performing marginalization through our embodied performances in the public sphere, in what they call the space of appearance, then this also encourages a kind of essentialism, a kind of stereotyping. So while the politics of presence might advance and enhance equality in democracy, it also entails this kind of confinements that reify our identities, harden our identities, and make it more difficult for us to explore our multiple selves. So this is basically the problem the book faces, and here is where the politics of becoming comes in as a kind of augmentation, a further development of the politics of presence. So it doesn't in itself contest or challenge the politics of presence, it rather builds on the politics of presence and on the arguments for identity politics, and explores identities in a more contingent, fluid, and performative way. So here I build on William Connolly, who uses this term, the politics of presence, and further develop it to explore the multiple self in radical democratic politics. And this argument for the politics of presence tries to combine the equality further through the politics of presence, actually, through this kind of embodied enactment of marginalization, combine this kind of equality with the freedom to explore the multiple self. So that's the argument in a nutshell, and now I'm going to try to unpack the argument in a bit more detail. A good starting point for this is Moya Lloyd's work, Beyond Identity Politics, an excellent book, which basically makes the argument that we never have set identities when we enter democratic spaces, participatory spaces. Rather, we always performatively create our identities through participation, in participation. So rather, in contrast to the liberal assumption that identities pre-exist politics, Lloyd makes the argument that it's only through politics, through participation, that we create our identities. So then we can actually already make a quite substantial alteration to the original politics of presence, which means that presence in itself is always performance. So if we take a quick look back at these examples, we can see how the suffragette movement here enacts a very particular kind of identity, right? Through the clothes they wear, through the posters they hold up, through the way they arrange themselves in this image. They perform respectable voters, respectable politicians. So they are seen as the future citizens, or they present themselves as the future citizens they want to be seen as. In slut walks, we can recognize the carnivalesque aspect of it and see how these women perform a very particular version of themselves that's probably not their everyday version, right? So there is a kind of carnival, a very active performance in this kind of identity politics. And if we look at the Million Hoodie March here as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, again, we recognize these performative aspects of dressing with the hoodies to reenact the victim of the crime, Trayvon Martin here, who was killed, which was the protest against, basically. So we can see these kinds of enactments in the classic politics of presence and in the kind of identity politics the feminist Democrats in the 1990s already talked about. So this is a good starting point to explore our fluidity, our transformability in democratic politics. But of course, I want to take this argument further. And in the book, I do that through assemblage theory. So in a nutshell, very bluntly put, assemblage theory claims that everything can be understood as an assemblage. And everything, whether it's a discursive phenomenon or a physical phenomenon or whatever it might be, can be analyzed through the various parts that come together and that have some kind of effect, some kind of effectivity, and that are drawn together in assemblages. So through this lens, we can first make sense of the democratic spaces I talked about earlier, right? So if we look at these spaces, democratic spaces, we can see that there's more to them than just the actual physical space that comes together here. It is also about the people who come together, who actually create and co-create the space that happens in the moment. So space becomes a fluid concept of an assemblage that happens in a particular moment and that disperses after. And of course, here I'm drawing on Hannah Arendt, who says the space of appearance comes into being where men, actually she says humans here, are together in the manner of speech and action. So it is space is here defined A as the physical bodies that come together, and B as the actions, the articulations these people engage in. So this is a good understanding of how democratic spaces assemble as fluid moments in a way, and they provide the context for the identities that are performed within these democratic spaces, right? So our identities are always context dependent, and we need a clear understanding of the spaces that make these identities possible. So now looking at identities through an assemblage lens, we can think about all the various parts that make up our identities in a very physical sense, but also in a discursive sense. So we can think about the bones, the muscles, the hairs, the blood cells, the hormones that circulate through our bodies, the bacteria, the fungi, the viruses, all these organisms that our bodies actually are host to. The food, the medicine, the microplastics, all the things that we consume that then circulate through our bodies. So just by looking at the material components of our bodies, actually, we already get an understanding of our bodies themselves being a quite fluid assemblage, an assemblage that's always in motion. But then we can go on to think about the discursive concepts of sexuality, class, race, gender, age, and so on, that we construct through our discourses, the culturally coded and gendered social protocols that teach us how to act, how to perform our identities, our opinion, views, desires that are all part of how we shape ourselves, how we shape our identities, and the clothing, makeup, all the accessories that we physically attach to express our identities or temporarily create our identities. So looking at all these very different components, of which some are more physical, some are more discursive, and some are more changeable than others, we can start to understand our identities as an assemblage that is by itself always very much in motion, and that we have some agency over to create ourselves as well. So further explore how we can gain agency in performing our own identities in democratic politics, Rancière's work is, I feel, very helpful in particular, the idea of interruption, right? For Rancière, interruption is something inherently democratic. It might also be in other people's work, it's something not democratic, and there are these aspects to it. But here, I'm interested about the democratic qualities, in the democratic qualities of interruption. And in Rancière's work, interruption always means that the police order, which is the current neoliberal order, the discursive order that tells us who we are, that assigns us a place, that gives us a name in society, and that in a way controls us, surveils us, and holds us in place. So interruption here comes into this police order and interrupts police through freedom and equality, through the inherent democratic ideas, concepts of freedom and equality. So we can now start to think about how our identity assemblages that are created by the police can be interrupted. And here, Rancière goes on to talk about disidentification. So that means interrupting our identities gives us an opportunity, at least temporarily, to take a distance, to create a distance between the identity that is created by society and that is assigned to us and our multiple selves. So through this kind of disidentification, we gain a bit of freedom, at least temporarily, to perform different versions of ourselves. And Rancière goes on to say that this is possible through improper names. So we can, rather than creating a new identity, a counter-identification, this would then again fall into the police logic of naming, of creating something stable. And in contrast, Rancière makes the argument, we need something temporary that is improper. It's not a real identity, it's an improper name. And one example might be the 99%, as put forward by the Occupy movement, that creates this kind of moniker, this kind of idea of a collective assemblage where people are partly anonymous, semi-anonymous, if you will, because they participate in this kind of a multitude. But then my question goes on, of course, we can get this kind of, gain this kind of agency by creating improper names as part of a collective. But what does this identification mean on an individual level? Which kind of freedoms do we as individuals have? And here I draw on Black and intersectional queer theory, who tells stories about very personal disidentifications. So here, the work of José Esteban Muñoz, for example, uses the very same term as Rancière and talks about disidentification as personal stories, personal journeys of queer people who discover, who explore their multiple selves, who reject the names that are assigned to them, and who create temporary counter-identifications. And we can further deepen this thought through the recent Black trans feminism by Marquardt, who actually goes further and says that we need to abolish identities altogether, right? So this is a radical approach to using abolition, the idea of abolishing slavery, abolishing the prison system today in the Black Lives Matter movement, and taking these ideas even further to abolish identity, because identities are the constructs that hold us in place and that keep us captive. So the idea of fugitivity from identity. So those ideas are theoretically, I find at least, very appealing, but how can we practice this identification in democratic processes? So here, of course, anonymity comes to mind, and the book explores anonymity, and we can understand anonymity here in the sense of these assemblages. When we think about the assemblages that I talked about earlier, if now masks or, for example, computer screens, smartphones, smart devices, these different screens, these different new interfaces interrupt our identities, our identity assemblages. When they're injected into our assemblages, we reconfigure temporarily. So we have this idea of interrupting our identities for a certain period of time through anonymity. And of course, anonymity isn't inherently democratic, actually not at all. It inherently enhances our freedoms, our freedom to act, to perform our identities. But this freedom can be used in democratic or anti-democratic ways, as here the example of the Pussy Riot movement illustrates, as a democratic movement that uses anonymity to contest established power asymmetries, and the Ku Klux Klan, who on the other hand uses anonymity to further strengthen or further advance inequalities through hate crimes. So anonymity is always ambiguous, and we need to use it consciously and carefully in democratic politics. And of course, anonymity plays an inherently important role in the digital age, because now we basically all have anonymity in our pockets all the time. We might not really realize it as much, but whenever we enter social media, when we join social media, we first need to make decisions on how to fill an empty screen, how to fill an empty profile, and we have a certain amount of agency over presenting ourselves in digital space here. So these new interfaces that now enter our identity assemblages act as kind of mirrors, but of course they're not objective mirrors. They are very much biased mirrors, if you will. So on the one hand, they are capitalist devices that are created to, as part of a market economy, to create profit. But on the other hand, they are also devices for our agentic articulation of ourselves. To a certain extent, we have more agency of creating a certain version of ourselves, certain versions of different platforms or different interfaces, and for different audiences. So these devices enter so deeply into our own socialization that now we start to see the world through digital devices, right? So our children are socialized through digital devices, and even we as adults, to a certain extent, start by engaging with social media content, for example. We start to see the offline world differently, right? We become so mesmerized by what's happening on the screen that we are re-socialized. If you think about body images, for example, how we can explore body images online and then reinterpret our own bodies offline in a different manner. So these kind of reconfigurations result in cyborgian reconfigurations and new cyborgian subjectivities, where we, in a very real sense, actually become cyborgs, not in the original in the original sci-fi sense, but in a very real sense, because we on a daily basis engage with these smart devices which become part of our identity assemblages, which enable us to reinterpret, reread our own identities. So as cyborgs, we have certain new abilities to participate in politics. And here, this is relevant, I think, for digital politics of presence. And I will just briefly give a few short examples to illustrate what that might look like. So the Occupy movement actually started as an online blog. We are the 99% that encouraged people to upload their selfies and talk about their political, their social situation and what the kind of precarity they are struggling with. So we can see how they play with anonymity and how they enact their bodies in certain ways and how they choose the frames in how they enact their bodies. So a pregnant woman talks about her lack of insurance, how she's scared about the future, and a similar situation for a man after a cancer surgery, actively displaying his scar, an obese man saying he is unemployable. So we can see how there's a certain agency in self-presentation as part of this kind of new politics of presence, digital politics of presence on the internet, or an online swarm that protested racism on Habbo Hotel, where there were rumors about the moderators of the online space being racist and discriminating against African-American looking avatars. So a swarm formed that created these very stereotypical avatars, and it did a kind of an online sit-in and blocked the different entrances to the different facilities. And finally, a very mundane way of how we use social media filters to, in Pride season, queer our identities and perform solidarity and make an argument for a more inclusive and tolerant society. So these are all examples of how this new digital politics of presence might look like. And finally, I want to raise the question, how does all of this relate to the bigger challenges that we situate this kind of identity, new identity politics, the politics of becoming in? We are living on a planet that's quite literally on fire. And the question is, what can these questions of identity, how can they be connected to larger democratic transformations that I think are so much needed? And here in the final chapter, the book proposes the idea of a democratic microverse. So it basically makes the argument that these personal transformations, they can serve as a seed for bigger democratic transformations. Because if people together and create these many different small democratic spaces, these democratic microverses that we have talked about a little bit in this presentation, we can see how they all prefigure a certain version of democracy. So that it's a prefigurative politics that makes a claim that democracy is happening here and now in this democratic microverse, and this might project a way forward towards a bigger democratic future. So on this note, I'd like to end the presentation. Thank you so much for listening. The book is open access, so just find it on the OUP website and you can download the PDF. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Hans. That was, yeah, an excellent presentation. And I'm still on a journey, right? Taking us from the start to the end. So thank you for that. I'm very keen to get stuck into the book, even more so now. Great. So what we're going to do now is we are going to head into a Q&A. Yes, I think everybody is seeing things that they are, which is good. But yeah, we've got some people in the room and of course some people online. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and then we will take questions as they come and respond as is fit. So, any questions? Or in the room? Jordan.
Great. Hey, thanks, Hans. Super interesting, and can't wait to find some time to read the book in full. I don't know, this might be something somewhat unrelated, but I was thinking particularly about the digital stuff you're talking about. I wonder if you had any reflections on what some developments occurring, I guess, since publication of the book, like the rolling out of like AI celebrity avatars to allow for like 24-hour live streaming and stuff, where basically these just fill a void for the person so that they don't actually have to do anything. I would be interested to hear your reflections on what this might mean as like a new step of digital anonymity and belonging.
Wow, that's that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that AI poses new challenges, and I mean, it's very, very much in the spirit of the book, asking about non-human participants and which role they play in our self-performances. Of course, they enter the kind of like they play a co-creative role in how we perform ourselves. Now, I think it is good to understand bots as non-human participants that, following the new materials theory that I'm drawing on for this book, have some kind of agency. But we also need to reflect, I think, on how they are, that they are programmed and created by humans, right? So there's always human intentionality behind algorithms, behind how bots are programmed and created and so on. So I think there are really interesting new challenges ahead and new things to talk about. I guess after the book, because also the book was a while in the making, and the whole ChatGPT thing, happened after in a way. So there are things forward, I think, that we need to think about and need to explore and need to kind of like focus on this. Something I'm still struggling with, like how to delineate the agency of humans that create non-humans in a way in this case, and the non-humans gaining agency on their own in this kind of like process of creating identity.
Are there any other questions online? Oh, otherwise we'll go to Wendy in the room.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk because I haven't finished reading the book, but I'm really enjoying it. I wondered if you could say a bit more. I think it's so interesting to think about performance, the idea of performing a role has been, ever since people kind of started engaging and talking to each other, and then there's masks and different things that you can do when you're in the real world. And I'm so interested to think about the similarities, but also the differences of how that plays out in online. The anonymity of being in a crowd in real life, like there are analogies there with being online, but actually online creates a whole different scope. And I think there are lots of benefits to being able to engage with people that you otherwise couldn't, you know, be visible to or couldn't engage with anonymously. But there's also so many risks, and I wonder how it makes people even, you talked about it makes you see the world differently. I just wondered if you could reflect on what are the risks of how people, the potential negatives of how it will, you know, enable people to engage in politics in a completely different new way.
Right. Oh, great question. Very a lot in there. So first, I think that in thinking about online versus offline, I think the distinction in the past has been overemphasized and in a way exaggerated, right? So there was a lot of emphasis on, you know, on the screen we're somebody completely different. We create a whole new identity. There's a whole new world online. It was like very much, you know, the research was focused on online versus offline. And then there is, you know, it was followed by much more talk about hybridity, and that's more the current debate, right? So everything is hybrid, the online, the offline come together. But actually, I would even go further and kind of like do away with the online offline distinction. I mean, we need it to a certain extent, but it's really not that much of a different thing, right? I need to choose my clothes every day and perform my identity this way. And I need to, you know, if I choose to, I can upload a new profile picture, which is in a way a very related thing, right? So those are all kind of like performative acts that create these identity assemblages, and the assemblages are always changing. And of course, there are different textures and different materials involved, and the digital materials, in a way, differ from the offline materials. But it's still also materials, and at least that's my understanding. So I see the whole identity expression thing, whether it's online or offline, as one thing. And I think actually in research, it decreasingly is important to make this kind of difference. We had we learned from Taina in the last seminar, right, about these identity performances of the activists she follows, and her ethnography is online and offline, and it doesn't make that much, you know, that much of a difference. But the online space, of course, provides some chances of doing things differently, and I think here the interruption is important, and I think the interruption is especially online, especially true because it's interrupting us spatially. So while we're usually like sitting in the same room and we're experiencing this actually right now in this situation, right? Some people are online, some people are offline, and that makes quite a big difference actually, who's physically co-present and who is digitally co-present. So I think these physical distances are really important, and they play into anonymity and create some other chances. So actually, maybe the question, if we talk about the harms, are not so much does anonymity increase my willingness or whatever it is to inflict harm on another person, but maybe it's the physical distance, right? So if somebody is on a screen, there's this huge physical distance that might dehumanize that person in my perception to a certain extent, where I don't really consider the harms as if I would be in the same physical room with that person. So the book tries to make sense of the harms and the benefits of anonymity. I focused on the positive part, and I do focus on the positive aspects in the book as well, because I'm interested in democratic agency here. But anonymity in the book, I say, enables 3 sets of contradictory freedoms. It's always freeing the democratic subject, but often freeing the subject also to do things that are anti-democratic. So they enhance inclusion and exclusion, right? Honesty and deception, and contestations, subversion, and submission. So there are always these kind of like pairs where you have positive and negative aspects, and they kind of like come together. And as democratic theorists, as designers of democratic spaces, we can think about how we can, create a certain space, a certain assemblage that benefits the more democratic aspects. But it's difficult to completely, I would say, get rid of the anti-democratic aspects, and that what just makes anonymity inherently contradictory in a way.
Antonin.
Hi, thanks, Hans. That was great. I had a chance also to hear on several occasions that talk and read the book. It's fantastic. I Yeah, I tell you all that you should read it. It's a great book. So I just had like a few like two points. And the first one kind of like relate to just what you just mentioned. So I think building on that point, I would like you to maybe say a few more points about that. So I really like how like the whole discussion starts with this whole idea of like a space of appearance and a rent, and this whole notion of like the in-betweenness, which is both a bit discursive, but also there is a physicality in the way we understand like this common world in a rent. So I was thinking about, so I was just wondering if you could say a few more words about how you think about this physicality of spaces, and how it shapes this idea of identity formation and reactualization. And what does it mean essentially for the way we design the democratic innovations? How should we think about this idea of both the discursive and the physicality of the spaces in which people engage in identity formation and shape their democratic agency? So how should that get into play in how we actually design and think about democratic innovations? And the second question is mostly, what does it mean for representation? The way we start to understand this idea of identity formations, of reclaiming new forms of identity, of this fluidity of identity. How do we think about representation in that specific framework? Thank you.
Yeah, great, fantastic question. Thank you, Tonen. Yeah, the materiality of the space of appearance or democratic spaces more generally, I think, is a bit under theorized, understudied, and underdeveloped also in many democratic innovations. I think because we come from this tradition of deliberative democracy, which very much focused on the verbal expression. And this is not just deliberative democracy, actually. It's really the whole discursive background where the social sciences come from, with Habermas on the discursive theories, but also the whole constructivism, right, which really basically argued that everything is some kind of discursive construction. We can only perceive reality through our socialized eyes, which are socialized through discourses. And here the book tries to go beyond that by drawing on new materialism and paying attention to the materiality. And I think what this means in practice for democratic innovations, and here, of course, with Selene and Ricardo, we've talked about nonverbal communication, for example, the relevance of bodies, of visuals, of sounds in democratic spaces. And I think there is so much practically to explore. Also the question of non-human participation, be it non-human animals or computers, robots, materials, right? There's so much to explore for democratic innovations, and this work is, of course, already partly done, right? So, but if we move a bit away from the discursive traditions and think about the role that materials can play in democratic spaces. There is, for example, playful engagement through prototyping. Rather than discussing an idea, we can create an idea with our hands in a playful manner, which taps into different effective resources, I think, that we as participants have. So artistic performances, playful parts of participation can play a big role in designing democratic innovations. If we think about citizens' assemblies, they are so talk-centric and also expert-centric, right? If instead we get together as part of these kind of citizens' assemblies, would have elements in there where we would play, where we would co-create something artistically, that I think is a really are interesting ideas to explore. The questions of representation, I think representation is a bit like the question of online versus offline, right? Online representations as well. I make sense of them as these kind of assemblages where everything connects to everything and the materiality plays a role, but still we can think everything together. And representations are attempts, and partly they are very institutionalized and legitimized attempts to stand for another person, right? But all these people relate to each other in these kind of assemblages, where the identity performance of my representative, if I accept it, or even if I don't accept it, in the eyes of others, might become part of my identity, right? So everything in a way is connected in these kind of assemblages, and representation is part of that. And we could turn the whole thing around and say everything is representation, everything represents something else, and is hence connected in these kind of assemblages. At least that's how I make sense of it.
Okay, I do just want to point out as well that Jesse had put the link for the book to download in the chat. So if you haven't got a digital copy of that yet, or if you want to get a hard copy, just follow that link and it will take you there. Before I ask a question of my own, were there any other questions or budding questions online or in the room? Well, I'll give it to Marquardt. Oh, Selene, go for it.
Hi, thanks Friedel and Hans. Really lovely session, and I've been enjoying the artistic presentation. Your slides are wonderful, Hans, and lovely to see Participedia folks online as well. I was not going to ask you a question because I have an opportunity to talk to Hans often, but at the same time, each time I listen to his presentation, a new question comes to mind. So that's why I decided to put my question forward. Hans, I know you're going to say this is not what the book is doing or trying to do, and I know it's beyond the scope of the book, but I'm interested in your ideas in response to the question that I'm going to ask. It's about the role of formal actors, say states. When we think about debates around politics of presence, politics of recognition, they were usually contrasted to a sort of a liberal state, liberal framework, where identities or identity matters are seen as private issues, and the advocates of identity politics, politics of recognition, said it's not good enough to sort of put the identity matters in the private sphere because they have implications for the public sphere as well. So it's important that we recognize differences, we recognize minority groups, etc., as a way of addressing marginalization and disadvantages, etc. So in those kind of debates, whether we should just be happy with the liberal system as it is, with individual rights, or whether we should recognize group rights and have a more strong politics of recognition in societies, there was always, these were philosophical questions, but also there was a question about the role of the state, the government. How do we recognize identities? And I completely agree with you when it comes to politics of recognition, how it could also essentialize identities. It's a kind of a double-edged sword. You don't want to put identities in boxes. You want to create space. You want to acknowledge that identities can change and can be fluid. So if I'm thinking about what you're proposing along these lines, I wonder what role, if any, do you see for the state, for the kind of democratic vision you're proposing? Are we going back to the liberal idea that we don't recognize any identities because recognizing might make them fixed, might sort of dismiss their fluid nature? Or what kind of political system, state are we imagining to support the kind of a vision that your book puts forward in terms of acknowledging fluid identities?
That's such a good question. Thank you, Selene. It's a very challenging question as well. I agree that partly, I mean, the way the state works, right? The logic of the state, by putting something into law, which is a long process, and then the laws usually existing for longer periods of time and being somewhat unstable, somewhat stable over longer periods of time, fixes our identities, right? When they concern our identities. So one question we could raise, which Anne Phillips did in the seminar recently, right, is how much does the state actually need to interfere with our identities? Maybe, as she argued, the abolition of the legal status of gender would open up freedoms for the democratic subject to create their identities in a more fluid way in politics, but not in, not through the state, not formalized through laws. So the question, one question is, how much does the state actually need to fix our identities? And if the state does need to secure rights, for example, along identity lines, then how can we come up with more fluid or more diverse understandings of gender identity, whatever the identity markers might be? And that's something that I think is more and more recognized and is more and more done. It's a painful process. The question is, do we need a third gender in the passport? Or do we need a gender in the passport at all? Or do we need 7 genders? Or do we need 20 genders? Or do we just need a self-defined gender? Those are all really, really interesting and good options that we need to think about. And in general, of course, I think the state plays a very important role in democratic politics, and a lot, if we think about non-human participation, if we think about sustainability and the future, I think the role should have a strong state in regulating a lot of our, especially regulating the economy and the environmental impacts. But when it comes to identity, we need to think about how the people want to identify, how they want to self-identify, and what agency we actually want to give to the state to make these kind of decisions.
Excellent question. And I think the question that I have sort of builds on that as well, which is great. And I'll try to put them into coherent words. So we'll see how that works. But in your book, you've talked about a lot about the fluidity of identities and everything. And so transformation is often messy. And there's often, and I suppose when it comes to the becoming and taking on an identity and building that identity, it isn't always a clear-cut and smooth process. And I guess the question that I have around this is, what sort of perhaps parameters for safety and making safe spaces for people to be able to fully embrace their identities? Like I hope that's making sense. Like, what do we have spaces that allow people to really embrace their identities or explore different identities without harm? Or is that the natural part of it? What sort of, I guess I'm just trying to find out what your thoughts are on what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And it's, context is so important. So one first note, maybe, because you say identity transformations aren't smooth, or they might be messy. I think that assessment only happens when we think that there's a clear path from one identity to another. If we think that identity can move in any direction, then the messiness is natural, and is nothing else is to be expected, right? So, but maybe more directly to your question about the context, I think it's so important to realize, and that's why the book also puts forward this spatial theory, right? That identities always emerge within space and are always situated in space, and the spaces co-create the identities, and the identities co-create the space. So in a way, to have these kind of safe spaces to explore our multiplicity, to be different if we want to every day, right? We need this kind of societies, the attitudes of people to, I think, to love themselves and to love others. And this self-love allows us to explore our own multiplicity, and the love for others, which is reflected in the love for the self, I guess, allows others to explore their inner multiplicity, right? So it is a lot, actually. It is not an individual endeavor to say, I'm now gonna, change myself and reinvent myself, because others will not even recognize the change, right? So it's always certainly embedded, and it's the argument is for deeper societal transformations, and that why I talk about this kind of democratic microverse, and the bigger societal transformations this needs to be embedded in, because it does need and then also sometimes people ask me like, how is self-transformation possible? Because we're so limited. I mean, we only have that body. We cannot really changing our bodies is really difficult, and we have that certain age, for example, and so on. But it's so much about perception. So I feel like I'm exploring a lot of identity change since I put on this lens of the politics of becoming. I see change everywhere, like in myself, in others. I change my expectations about my friends. When I meet my friends after a longer time, I don't expect them, or try at least not to expect them to be the same person anymore, right? So this kind of change is a lot about our own attitudes and the change that we allow ourselves to have and allow others to have. So it's an appeal to society to, I guess, be more loving and love yourself and love others.
So thank you. Right, so we've got a couple of minutes left. I see Mary's raised her hand, but Mary, go for it. Oh, I think you're still on mute. Is there a way to unmute?
Yeah, that's true.
Does that work? Oh, I think you're typing it in the chat, so we'll keep an eye for that. Oh, okay. Are you happy to write the question in the chat, Mary? Cool, thank you. In the interim, would you like to expand on anything you've responded thus far? Or what you wanted to make in your presentation more but haven't had a chance to?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the critique I get a lot, I can criticize myself because yeah, I mean that kind of like digital technologies, it might sound a bit like the book is like making an argument that they are inherently liberating or something, and that's really not what the book is doing. And we need to pay attention to the fact that these spaces are inherently capitalist spaces, right? Like social media, they're all like created to somehow generate profits. So how can they be democratic? But then, like, my response, if I was going to ask myself the question, is always that often democratic spaces are actually commercial spaces, right? Like the market places, the agora, were often the places where people got together because they sold and bought stuff. And that's the spaces where people meet and where we talk to each other. So the fact that they've been created to capitalist ends doesn't mean that we cannot reappropriate them, that we can't claim them for our own participation. That's the angle the book pursues, rather than making the argument that digital spaces are inherently democratic.
Intentional. Yeah, the platforms themselves and the corporations behind the platforms. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I'm just waiting for Mary's question to come through, and I will try to unmute from our end. There it is. Excellent, thank you for that. So Mary asked, you mentioned the work of Arendt on appearance. My understanding of her take on appearance is located in a public space, and I wondered if digital presence has a very private dimension and how the public-private distinction plays into this. Is the digital space a new virtual public space?
Oh, excellent question. Thank you, Mary. Wow. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I feel that the digital space inherently has some private dimensions to it, because it's a private, often run by private, or almost always, often, okay, run by private companies. It's a part of a market economy, as I just said, but also because people perceive digital spaces sometimes as more private because they're physically located in their private spheres. And there's an interesting reconfiguration between public and private happening in digital spaces, because we're often physically located in our private homes while participating in the public sphere. So one argument the book makes is that anonymity, and online anonymity in particular, reconfigures private and public to a certain extent, because private sentiments, private ideas, ideas that actually emerge in private space are then transmitted within being physically located in private space into public space. So there's an interesting reconfiguration between private and public happening. So I still think that social media is a space of appearance. It is a very public space, but again, it's not the original ideas that we had about the space of appearance about the public sphere, because in physical publics, it was very easy to understand who the audience was. It was the people physically present. But then with media, and that of course starts before the internet, right? With the written word and then with video audio recordings and so on, there was this kind of transmission happening. So public sphere was already reconfiguring. And now with digital spaces, this happens even more. So there's a space of appearance where we're often not really aware of the audience who will actually be able to perceive our performances. That's a matter of our own awareness, but also of who's actually gonna, engage with your social media content online. So yeah, and then there's the question of how permanent are your articulations? Where are they stored and saved? Who else is reading along, right? And the whole kind of like surveillance, all the surveillance aspects of the new public sphere. So who are the actual audiences? Who is the public sphere, right? Who will receive the message? And because we're physically distant, what we talked about earlier, right? Because we're physically distant from our audiences, this really changes the dynamics of politics, I think.
Thank you for that. Thank you for all of the questions. That brings us to time. So yeah, just want to thank everybody for joining, and thank you, Hans, again for the great presentation. And yeah, very keen to get stuck into the book more, as I said before. And yeah, the link is in the chat if anybody would quickly like to make use of that to download the book. But as I said before, thank you very much for joining us online and in the room. And yeah, we'll see you next time. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Friedel. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Friedel. Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Friedel.
Hans.
Bye, everyone.